Chapter 15, Part 4 of How I Found Livingstone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. How I Found Livingstone. Travels, Adventures, and Discoveries in Central Africa, including 4 months' residence with Dr. Livingstone. By Sir Henry M. Stanley. Chapter 15, Part 4. Homeward Bound, Livingstone's Last Words, the Final Farewell. On the 12th of April, after 6 hours of the weariest march I had ever undergone, we arrived at the mouth of the Mukondokwa Pass, which out of the river debouches into the plain of Makata. We knew that it was an unusual season, for the condition of the country, though bad enough the year before, was nothing compared to this year. Close to the edge of the foaming, angry flood lay our route, dipping down frequently into deep ditches, wherein we found ourselves sometimes up to the waist in water, and sometimes up to the throat. Urgent necessity impelled us onward, lest we might have to camp at one of these villages until the end of the monsoon rains. So we kept on, over marshy bottoms, up to the knees in mire, under jungly tunnels dripping with wet, then into sloughs armpit deep. Every channel seemed filled to overflowing, yet down the rain poured, beating the surface of the river into yellowish foam, pelting us until we were almost breathless. Half a day's battling against such difficulties brought us, after crossing the river, once again to the dismal village of Mvuni. We passed the night fighting swarms of black and ferocious mosquitoes, and in heroic endeavours to win repose and sleep, in which we were partly successful, owing to the utter weariness of our bodies. On the 13th we struck out of the village of Mvumi. It had rained the whole night, and the morning brought no cessation. Mile after mile we traversed, over fields covered by the inundation, until we came to a branch riverside once again, where the river was narrow, and too deep to ford in the middle. We proceeded to cut a tree down, and so contrived that it should fall right across the stream. Over this fallen tree the men, bestriding it, cautiously moved before them their bales and boxes; but one young fellow, Rojab, through overzeal or in utter madness, took up the doctor's box which contained his letters and journal of his discoveries on his head, and started into the river. I had been the first to arrive on the opposite bank, in order to superintend the crossing, when I caught sight of this man walking in the river with the most precious box of all on his head. Suddenly he fell into a deep hole, and the man and box went almost out of sight, while I was in an agony at the fate which threatened the dispatches. Fortunately he recovered himself and stood up, while I shouted to him, with a loaded revolver pointed at his head, "Look out! Drop that box, and I'll shoot you." All the men halted in their work while they gazed at their comrade who was thus imperilled by bullet and flood. The man himself seemed to regard the pistol with the greatest awe, and after a few desperate efforts succeeded in getting the box safely ashore. As the articles within were not damaged, Rojab escaped punishment, with a caution not to touch the box again on any account, and it was transferred to the keeping of the sure-footed and perfect pagazi, Maganga. From this stream in about an hour we came to the main river, but one look at its wild waters was enough. We worked hard to construct a raft, but after cutting down 4 trees, and lashing the green logs together, and pushing them into the whirling current, we saw them sink like lead. We then tied together all the strong rope in our possession, and made a line 180 feet long, with one end of which tied to his body. Chowpereh was sent across to lash it to a tree. He was carried far down the stream, but being an excellent swimmer he succeeded in his attempt. The bales were lashed around the middle, and, heaved into the stream, were dragged through the river to the opposite bank, as well as the tent, and such things as could not be injured much by the water. Several of the men, as well as myself, were also dragged through the water, each of the boys being attended by the best swimmers, but when it came to the letter boxes and valuables, we could suggest no means to take them over. 2 camps were accordingly made, one on each side of the stream, one on the bank which I had just left occupying an ant hill of considerable height, while my party had to content itself with a flat, miry marsh. An embankment of soil, nearly a foot high, was thrown up in a circle 30 feet in diameter, in the centre of which my tent was pitched, and around it booths were erected. It was an extraordinary and novel position that we found ourselves in. Within 20 feet of our camp was a rising river, with flat, low banks. Above us was a gloomy, weeping sky; surrounding us on 3 sides was an immense forest, on whose branches we heard the constant pattering rain. Beneath our feet was a great depth of mud, black and loathsome. Add to these the thought that the river might overflow, and sweep us to utter destruction. In the morning the river was still rising, and an inevitable doom seemed to hang over us. There was yet time to act, to bring over the people with the most valuable effects of the expedition, as I considered Dr. Livingstone's journal and letters, and my own papers, of far greater value than anything else. While looking at the awful river, an idea struck me that I might possibly carry the boxes across, one at a time, by cutting 2 slender poles and tying cross sticks to them, making a kind of hand barrow on which a box might rest when lashed to it. 2 men swimming across at the same time holding on to the rope, with the ends of the poles resting on the men's shoulders, I thought would be enabled to convey over a 70-pound box with ease. In a short time one of these was made, and 6 couples of the strongest swimmers were prepared, and stimulated with a rousing glass of stiff grog each man, with a promise of cloth to each also if they succeeded in getting everything ashore undamaged by the water. When I saw with what ease they dragged themselves across, the barrow on their shoulders, I wondered that I had not thought of the plan before. Within an hour of the first couple had gone over, the whole expedition was safe on the eastern bank, and at once breaking camp we marched north through the swampy forest, which in some places was covered with 4 feet of water. 7 hours' constant splashing brought us to Rahenko, after experiencing several queer accidents. We were now on the verge only of the inundated plain of the Makata, which, even with the last year's rain, was too horrible to think of undertaking again in cold blood. We were encamped 10 days on a hill near Rahenko, or until the 25th, when, the rain having entirely ceased, we resolved to attempt the crossing of the Makata. The bales of cloth had all been distributed as presents to the men for their work, except a small quantity which I retained for the food of my own mess. But we should have waited a month longer, for the inundation had not abated 4 inches. However, after we once struggled up to our necks in water, it was useless to turn back. For 2 marches of 8 hours each we plunged through slush, mire, deep sloughs, water up to our necks, and muddy cataclysms, swam across nullahs, waded across gullies, and near sunset of the second day arrived on the banks of the Makata River. My people are not likely to forget that night; not one of them was able to sleep until it was long past midnight because of the clouds of mosquitoes, which threatened to eat us all up. When the horn sounded for the march of another day, there was not one dissentient amongst them. It was 5 a.m. when we began the crossing of the Makata River, but beyond it for 6 miles stretched one long lake, the waters of which flowed gently towards the Wami. This was the confluence of the streams. 4 rivers were here gathered into one. The natives of Kigongo warned us not to attempt it, as the water was over our heads, but I had only to give a hint to the men, and we set on our way. Even the water, we were getting quite amphibious, was better than the horrible filth and piles of decaying vegetation which were swept against the boma of the village. We were soon up to our armpits, then the water swallowed to the knee, then we stepped up to the neck, and waded on tiptoe, supporting the children above the water, and the same experiences occurred as those which we suffered the day before, until we were halted on the edge of the little Makata, which raced along at the rate of 8 knots an hour, but it was only 50 yards wide, and beyond it rose a high bank and dry parklands which extended as far as Simbo. We had no other option than to swim, but it was a slow operation, the current was so swift and strong. Activity and zeal, high rewards, presents of money, backed by the lively feeling that we were nearing home, worked wonders, and in a couple of hours we were beyond the Makata. Cheery and hopeful, we sped along the dry, smooth path that now lay before us, with the ardour and vivacity of heroes, and the ease and power of veterans. We rolled 3 ordinary marches into one that day, and long before night arrived at Simbo. On the 29th we crossed the Ungerengeri, and as we came to the Simbamwenni, the lion city of Useguhha, lo, what a change! The flooded river had swept the entire front wall of the strongly walled city away.